Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar will be on coloring graphic novels with David Cumbo. Before we start the webinar, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to share with everyone. The webinar will be approximately 1 hour long. All attendees will be muted. There will be a Q&A session at the very last 15 minutes of the webinar. The attendees can ask questions in the GoToWebinar question box right away, so please start doing that as soon as possible. Due to time constraints, not all questions will be answered. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared on social media and will be sent via email to all registrants and attendees. Today's panelists are myself, Fahim Niaz, Michi Catanese from Graphicsly, and then also the presenter, David Cumbo. For those of you who are new to Clip Studio Paint is your all-in-one solution for stunning, ready-to-publish illustrations, comics, manga, and animations. For more information on Clip Studio Paint, please check us out at clipstudio.net/en or at graphicsly.com. And with that, I will be passing the reins of the webinar over to David, where he will start his presentation.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clear.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. This is going to be a lot of fun. I am Dave, and I've got so much to share with you today. I don't even know if we're going to get to all of it, but I'm going to do everything I can to squeeze all this information into the roughly 45 minutes or so that I have to show you some art techniques that you can use in Clip Studio Paint. So because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to jump right into it. But first, I want to give you a little bit of an intro about who I am. So I'm going to show you some of the work that I've done. First, I got started in video games and animation, and I work for a game studio called Insomniac Games in California. And then I left and formed a company focused on graphic novel production, and really increased my interest in storytelling, visual storytelling over time, and this was a great way to do it. So I started with a project called Dreamside, which is about a young girl named Sarah who has a form of pediatric cancer and sort of escapes into a fantasy world in an attempt to discover a sense of meaning in her difficult situation. So these are some illustrations from Dreamside. All of these were done in Clip Studio. And this is a fantasy character that visits Sarah and pulls her into the world of Dreamside. And that's a project that's going to be coming out in the future. The book 1 of 3 is actually finished, and we just had to jump ahead and work on another project first, and that is what I'm mostly going to focus on today, and that is art from my new graphic novel Yooka-Laylee and the Kracklestone. This is based on the video game Yooka-Laylee. It is a brand new story, and here are some samples of what the pages look like. So I'm going to show you today a little bit, as much as I can, about how I produce pages like this, and I thought to maybe focus mostly on the coloring, but I am going to take you through kind of all the stages. Just I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time in each one, but this will give you a look at what the pages actually look like from the book. And all right, so what I'm going to do is jump over to Clip Studio here, and I'm going to focus on one page in particular. So what I just showed you was a page. I'm just going to turn on all my layers here. So this page that you just saw in the previews. So this is mostly what I'm going to focus on today, and I'm going to show you how I draw Yooka, which is this green chameleon guy, and then I'm also going to show you how I draw a certain element within the background. And I use the same process, but there's so many stages to my coloring that I'm trying to kind of hone it in a little bit to make it a little less, let's say, daunting or confusing to people who might be just starting out or not really sure how to go about coloring. So this will give you hopefully a step-by-step process of how you can do it. So what I'm going to do is actually take you through the steps. And so I'm just going to start from scratch here. And I'm going to show you basically how I go through and color a character. Say, for example, this drawing right here of Laylee, for example, how I go through the various phases. And first, I'm just going to describe what's happening. Now, with with digital coloring, sometimes you really run into a problem where things can look a little bit, well, digital. So you want to try and give them as much of an organic look as possible. So let me actually just show you what the stages are that I go through with this character. The first thing, and the most obvious thing, is to do a sketch. Now, I actually am not, I don't retain my pencil sketches, unlike a lot of comic artists. So once I get the pencil sketch in, I do tend to delete it, or I convert the pencil sketch into the line art. But this is what the line art looks like. And you'll notice that the line art itself is colored. I think for a lot of people, line art is, there are an awful lot of tutorials out there that demonstrate line art. You can produce line art on your own using pen and paper. You can scan it in, and you can use it as a foundation. But in this case, I have line art just on its own. You can see how it's got a transparent background. So I do just have the line art itself. Now, one thing that I do that I don't see an awful lot of comic artists do is I do complete my outlines. So you'll notice that I don't actually have any gaps. And one of the reasons I do that is to assist with my coloring style. So let me just turn on my flats layer. Actually, this is not a traditional flats layer in the sense that I have selectable flats. But what I'm doing is I'm putting my base colors on one layer. And one of the ways to do that that's quite fast is to take advantage of the anti-overflow features that Clip Studio offers. So I'll show you that in a bit. Once I go from there, I'll do a shading level, which is basically just to add shadows to it. So I do that on a multiply layer, and I'll demonstrate how I get these soft edges and all of that and kind of keep things constrained. And I have a specular, what I call a specular highlight layer. So this is where light kind of creates a shimmer. And sometimes I'll break this up into a few layers, but for the sake of today's presentation, I'm going to keep it relatively simple. Then I also do a highlight layer that it goes a little bit beyond the speck, where there's kind of a blurred out highlight as well, and I think that just helps really make it pop. And then I also do a sort of a gradient overlay, which is a common feature in my work because it allows me to create an interesting sort of gradient of color. And then from there, I can add various details, and maybe I do things like bounce light. Okay, so let me actually just go right ahead, and I'll just start something from scratch here and demonstrate how I will actually assemble this. So for example, if I'm drawing Yooka, I've got a basic pencil brush here. I use the bleed pencil, which is, I don't believe this is included with the program, but you can find it within the store. So I'm just gonna rough out a really quick head for Yooka. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this because we don't have a lot of time today, but I've drawn so many Yookas that I pretty much know just what he looks like without having to look at a reference drawing. So let's go ahead and put this kind of rough in like that. This is right where his jaw is, thereabout. Okay, and once I get this rough done, I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to turn the transparency down, or the opacity down on the rough layer. This is going to allow me to focus on the line art itself. So I use just a basic G pen. This is included with Clip Studio, so no worries about having access to these brushes. I am using the stabilization, and this is something that's extremely useful to assist with getting a very nice, elegant line without having to worry about a lot of jitter. And to turn that on, in case you don't see that within the G Pen settings, just click down here at the sub tool. Now, Fahim, I'm going to ask you here. I hope my icons are clear enough on the screen that you can see what I'm clicking on.
Yes, we're able to see those.
Okay, perfect. So you'll notice that you have an awful lot of settings here that you can mess with in terms of the brush. And if you go down, I believe to, oh, no, where is it? If we go to correction under brush size, you're going to see the option for stabilization. And just like all of these settings, if you click this little eyeball option here, it'll make the option appear. So make sure that that's visible, and then you can turn it up and down. If I turn it down, for example, it's going to give me full control over it. Every little jitter is going to be picked up, but if I keep it up to where I normally keep it, it's going to allow me to get a nice, elegant line. So basically what I'll do, and this is going to be very rough, much rougher than I would normally do, I'm going to go really quickly here, just in terms of getting kind of a finished line, just so I can demonstrate the next set of features that you can take advantage of here. You can see with the stabilization features that once you develop a sort of a muscle memory for this stuff, you can very quickly come in and be able to create pretty nice line art. without having to mess around too much in noodle areas. You know how tough that can be when you're drawing on paper, so this does make the process a lot faster. You see I go in and amplify a little bit some of the sections, you know, where I want there to maybe be a little bit more of a line thickness. Now, if this is one of the drawings for the comic, I'm actually going to go in and seal this, just because I would normally make sure that every area is sealed. And here you can see I've changed my mind about something that I want. So I'm going to make what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw with transparency. So I have the black color right now, but I'm going to switch over to transparent, and that way I can kind of erase out the section that I don't want. I don't actually use the eraser tool. I use transparent drawing, and the reason for that is because I want to take advantage of the same tool that I use to actually draw, and that way you have a nice consistent application of the tool. And let me just block off his crests here. I think that's what it's called on a chameleon, the crest. All right, so there we go. So I have my line art. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to color it. I'm going to get rid of my pencil line underneath. I'm going to make a new layer, and then I'm going to take advantage of what's called the anti-overflow features. So I'm going to use I'm going to switch over to marker, and there's an option I use called the fill-in mono pen, which I do actually keep anti-aliased. I don't use aliasing. I don't worry about that because I'm doing full color comics, so it's not terribly important for me. But the idea here is I'm going to select the colors roughly that I want for Yooka. And what I have here is, once again, if we scroll down, I have an option for right here where it says do not exceed the line of reference layer. And this is found under anti-overflow. So if you, once again, if you open up your subtool settings, you'll see do not exceed line of reference layer. Make sure that's checked. Okay. And then once that's checked, I'm going to select the line layer itself up here. See this little option up here in the upper right that I have called set as reference layer. That's going to mark the line as a reference that the color layer is going to use to block in the color. Okay, now you can do this with a paint bucket tool as well, but I'm going to focus on using this marker, and I'll show you why in just a second. So watch what happens here. Very quickly, we go in and put the color in, and you can see that it does not exceed the line. Okay, now the reason I don't just use the paint bucket tool is sometimes when you're drawing, a line will have a gap, and maybe that gap is a little bit bigger than the gap closing feature can accommodate. There is an option here to close the gap, but I don't actually take that much advantage. I don't rely on that too much, because often when I'm working with line art, the truth is that maybe I only want to color a portion of his head, for example, but I don't want it to go beyond the line, because maybe over on the left side here I'm doing a different color or something like that. So using the marker lets me kind of control in real time as I go, but it still lets it constrain within the line. Okay, let's get his crest colors in there. Now you can see what happened here. See how I got a little bit of the white showing through there. In that case, what I do is I just switch over to the pen, still have the color selected, and I color that in manually. There is a feature when using this where you can scale up. So it's called area scaling, and once again, it's a feature that you can find within the subtool settings. And I have it set all the way up. So what that's actually doing, if I turn off the line art, you can see that it's going beyond, sort of within the line itself. You can see how far the green goes here. This grayed out area here, that shows the edge of the line. Okay, and you can see that it's actually going beyond the line, because if you don't use that feature, I'll show you what happens. I'll make a new layer, and I'm going to turn that area scaling off. And now let me fill again, and you can see how you get this white sort of ghosting edge around, and that's a really big problem for print, because sometimes plates get a little offset. So you can see by using area scaling, that takes care of that problem. Okay, now let me jump into something that I think will be probably one of the most, this is going to be so useful to anybody doing any sort of illustration work. This is something that I've honed in on over quite a few years of working in digital art. And so this is going to be a little confusing, so bear with me on this, because it's very, very hard to explain exactly what I'm doing here. But basically, I've got a brush on here that's really just a standard soft brush. I can adjust the hardness settings here. I usually keep it around 3 or 4 out of the 5 features here in terms of hardness. So I do have somewhat of a harsh edge, but I have the ability to let it go soft, and so just like kind of like a normal brush that you would find in Clip Studio or Photoshop or Sci or whatever software you're using. I'll make a new layer and I'm going to switch it to multiply. And what I'm going to do is the shadows on the character here. Now, the thing that I really want to draw attention to is the cursor itself. So hopefully you can see the cursor. And Fahim, is that showing up? Can you see my cursor well enough, the actual indication of the size of the cursor?
Yes, yes, we can see that.
Okay, now I'm drawing right now on a Wacom Cintiq. This is a 12-year-old Wacom Cintiq. This is the 21UX, so it's showing its age. But basically, what I've got on the Cintiq is the ability to raise and lower the size of the brush. Okay, so I've got a slider here over on the right. Now, if you don't have access to a Cintiq and or a Wacom tablet or something that has hotkeys, you can use the bracket keys in Clip Studio and on your keyboard. So you can just raise and lower it that way. But the idea is, in real time, as I am painting over the character to do my shadow shapes, I want to raise and lower the size of the brush. So what I'm going to do is first to show you how I work, and I'm going to do this very quickly, and then I'll kind of show you what I do sort of at a bit more carefully so that you can really see what's going on. So I'm just going to go in here and put the shadow in on the character. All right, so just this is basically how I do this stuff. And I'm going to switch to transparency and start pulling areas out. Okay, I'm going to switch over to the blurring tool. So under color mixing, I have this option blur. This is a brush that's included with the software. And once again, I'm going to raise and lower the size of the brush, and I'm going to be able to blur out areas. So we'll get a very soft shadow. And you can see I'm going over the lines here, but that's not important. And the reason is because, once again, because the line art is the reference layer, say for example, I switch over to the select, or I can just go back to my marker tool and then use the transparency to just clean up around the edge because it's using the line art as a reference. And I can also do that within the piece itself, right? So I can switch back and forth between my brush, okay? And you can see how I'm shrinking the brush down so I can get into a tighter area here, okay? Just like that. And then I want to get into a really, really harsh edge here because this is his eyelid, for example. That's going to cast a really tight shadow around him. Okay, and let's turn up the brush density a little bit so I get a bit more of a result. Okay, once again, I'm just shrinking and increasing the size of the brush as I go in real time, depending on the needs of the particular area that I'm drawing. Right here, shrink it down a little bit so I can get into that kind of tighter area there. And then maybe I want to do a very broad area on the top of the head here. So I'm going to increase the size of the brush and maybe a little bit down here on the far side. Give that a bit more of an organic look. Okay. So without getting too detailed, this is basically how I paint in my shadows, which is easily the most time-consuming process of what I do. But I do think that this results in some really cool looking stuff. And it does give it a very, very illustrative quality that you often don't get this level of organic detail in comic coloring. But I think it's really cool if you can take the time and add this to your books, because it's gonna really make a big difference for the reader. Get a little bit of a harsh shadow, and you can see how I'm raising and lowering the size of the brush. I have to keep reminding what I'm doing there, because I've gotten so used to it. I kind of do it now without even really thinking about it. But you know, if you practice a lot, you'll adapt the same sort of. You kind of lose yourself in what you're doing, and you don't really have to even think too hard about it. So that's basically how that works. Now, one of the things I want to show you is how I do bounced light. Actually, let me just clean up that outer shadow here first. Okay, I'm going to show you how I do something called bounce light. So basically, let's just imagine that this is a sunny scene, and maybe there's maybe he's standing over a pool of water or something that's reflecting a bright kind of blue light back up. What I'm basically doing is painting the inverse of what I'm doing right here in the same way that I just painted the shadow. So I'm going to switch over to the same brush. I'm not using a special brush or anything like that. Maybe I'll do kind of a aquamarine color. okay? And I'm gonna create a new layer here that is a screen layer. And now, since this is going over the multiply layer, it's gonna add color to it. And I'm just gonna go ahead and soften the brush. And now I'm gonna get the underside of things. So this is thinking about light that's shining upward. So it's kind of the opposite of the main light source. This is what bounce light really is. If you can see this very simply, like if you were to go into a very brightly lit room, or maybe out on a sunny day, if you hold your hand over something, then you'll see a little bit of the ground reflect up on your hand. So bounce light is one of those things I like to exaggerate a little bit, and try and get as much of an effect as I can to just create a very realistic sort of illumination, kind of environmental illumination. This might sound a little bit like overkill, and of course sometimes I maybe I do this for bigger drawings that aren't quite as detailed. Maybe as things get a little smaller, I won't do it as much, but that's basically how that works. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get the rest of him. So maybe that's good for the bounce light. Okay, and you know what? Why don't I just color in these the rest of these areas on him as well, just so we can see what's going to happen now. And maybe give him his blue eyes and white of the eye there too. Turn those back on. There we go. So you can see how you can go back and forth and adjust things as necessary. Okay, I want to show you something that I call ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is an extremely cool effect if done right. What ambient occlusion basically is it's a CG term, really. It doesn't actually apply to traditional art, but it's something that I'm used to doing in a 3D space. And the idea with ambient occlusion is it's sort of an additive shadow where objects that get close together gain a little bit of extra shadow. Just like if you imagine the corner of a room, the corner of the room will be darker. Just the way that the light can't really get into that crevice as tightly. Okay, and so I do try to indicate that as much as I can, and often I'll do this on the multiply layer, but I'm just going to do this on a separate layer just so that you can see what's happening here. I might not use quite as dark of a shadow here, but the idea is anywhere that I have an intersection, that I'm basically going to add in something that kind of goes over the line, just adds a little bit of extra realism to the piece by having this sort of increased shadow in the crevices. So maybe like down here. It's amazing what this can add if you're trying to do a very realistically rendered scene. Even if it's using very cartoony shapes, it's good to be able to try and increase the realism of it and not have to limit yourself to just the kind of the flat effects that you get with a lot of kind of traditional comic shading and coloring. If you just try and do something that goes a little bit beyond, you can get a really stunning result. So you can see just by doing a quick little thing there, that added a hint of additional realism to the coloring. Okay, and then one last thing I want to show you before I, actually two things I want to show you before I jump over to show you some environment stuff. I'm going to create a highlight layer, and I'm going to do this with a screen, and I'm going to switch over to what I think the sun color would be. In this case, I'm going to choose kind of a yellow-green. And I'm going to switch the brush to a harder setting, maybe around there. No, one more. And I'll turn the density way down. Okay, so what we're going to do here is kind of just like I did the opposite for bounce light. I'm going to go back to the orientation that the sun is shining down. And once again, I'm going to increase and decrease the size of the brush here to create kind of hard little points. This is a case where I actually want to have some kind of sharper lines. Because that highlight is we're gonna be able to indicate the texture of the object itself, which his skin is not quite the same texture as his eyeball. The eyeball and skin are not quite the same texture as, say, the grass beneath him, right? So there's kind of a little bit of a hint of maybe perspiration on the skin, and so I can get a little harsh with the highlights here because we want to indicate that make it look a little shiny, basically. And so that's what this layer will accomplish. So again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but that gives you an idea of how the highlight will work. And then one last thing I want to show you is how I color the lines. Now, if you look up in the Layers tab, you'll see an option up here called Lock Transparent Pixel. If I'm on the line layer, I can click that. And what that's going to do is it's going to ensure that anything that I do to this layer is going to limit its application to the line itself. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a color that's similar to the fill color for any particular area. In this case, this green color. I'm going to go very dark with it, and I'm going to switch over to the pen because I want to have a very definitive application of this color. Maybe that's a little bit dark. And what I'll do is I'll just go over the whole thing really very, very quickly with one color because there's no sense wasting time just kind of doing it piecemeal when basically I'll pick the color that is going to mostly be used, and then I can go in and do each individual area. This is a time-consuming process, let me tell you. But I think the end result is worth it. Because when you do this throughout a whole page, it creates a very beautiful effect. Even things like the eye, I'll go in and just make sure that we're choosing a color that's appropriate for that. Here, you can see how the line's getting lost. So I want to make sure that I choose a darker green color for this, because this is kind of in shadow here. All right, again, I'm being rougher, a little bit rougher than I would normally be just because we're low on time. But anyway, there you go. That's pretty much how it's done. And there are some additional things that I can do, like add shadow to the eyes, just indicate where there are going to be highlights and that sort of thing. And this is just a real quick application of that. Maybe I'll go on top of everything, make a new layer. Maybe I'll use maybe I'll put a little highlight on the eye like this. Turn up the hardness and the density so we get more of an application, get a few little shimmers here and there. So this is the way that you can just kind of polish things as you go. So all right, there you go. That's pretty much how it's done. So I do that, but I do it with everything. So let me demonstrate some environment work now, so you can see how I apply this same technique to the background. And what I want to do is focus on the tree here itself. Fahim, can you tell me roughly how we're doing on time?
We're good. We have plenty of time, solid 15 minutes.
Oh, good. We have 15 minutes left, you mean?
Correct, yes.
Perfect. That is perfect timing. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off all these layers here, with the exception of the line art. Now, in this page, I've actually already colored the line, so you can see how it really is a complicated, time-consuming process to do. But once again, I think it's worth it. So let's go ahead and focus on this tree. So I'm going to color this basically how I would if this was from scratch, and we'll just take up the rest of the time that we have here for me to demonstrate and show you how this is actually done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just redo the steps that I just demonstrated to you, but now we're going to do it to a background object. What's kind of cool about this is I'll be able to focus a little bit more on that ambient occlusion effect, which is something that becomes a bigger presence in the background. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is put my flats in, and in this case I'm actually going to use flats. So I'll switch back over to my marker. Once again, my line art is selected as the reference layer. In case you forgot, it's this button up here, set as reference layer. Sorry if I'm going a bit fast, but I just want to make sure that we get through a lot of this. And of course, this will be recorded, and you'll be able to watch this later, I think. So if you miss anything, you can always come back and check it out later. So once again, we're just going to very quickly go through here, and I'm going to put my base colors in. And you can see how immensely fast this process really is in Clip Studio, because by using that anti-overflow feature, now you can see here, this is one of the reasons that I use the pen as opposed to the paint bucket tool, because in some cases I may need to be very careful about how I'm applying these colors. And so having that sort of real-time, that ability to decide in real time is a really big benefit. One reason that you're noticing that I'm getting all of these white marks is because the line itself is actually not a hard edge. It's got a little bit of anti-aliasing to it. I think I might have scaled this drawing, so it's not giving me a perfectly hard edge. It's still going over the line thanks to the the area scaling feature. It'd be much worse than this. So what I do to clean this up, once again, is I just go back to the pen. I'm gonna on the Mac, I'm gonna choose select the Option key, hold that down. That brings up the eyedropper tool, which you can also get in the toolbar over here. I'll pick that color, and then with the pen tool, I'm just gonna go over these areas and just wipe out all of that kind of white noise in here. And I'll do that over the whole thing. Of course, that, once again, time consuming, so we'll just do a little bit of it, and then we'll get moving on here. All right, so let's just say that I'm happy with the way that this works here. So I'm gonna go to the next step, which is to add shadow. So what I have here right now, you can see in the shadow layer, I've got my hard edges, and I'm considering the sunlight direction, which is basically something like, it's coming down to maybe something like that. So a little bit from the front, kind of a little bit angled to the left. So we have to consider how the light is being cast down and what the shadow shapes would be. And a lot of this just really comes down to practicing, understanding your 3D shapes and being able to just learn to construct objects in 3D. And that, unfortunately, goes a little outside the scope of this webinar. But the more you draw, the more you'll get used to constructing three-dimensional shapes. So once again, I'm going to demonstrate how I use the slider to raise and lower the size of the brush. Switch that to a multiply layer. And you'll notice I also rotate the canvas occasionally, which I do by holding the R key. Now, this is what's called a spring-loaded function. So I will hold the R key, I'll make the adjustment, and then when I'm done, I'll let go of the R key and it will snap back to the tool that I'm using. This saves a lot of time. And I actually have the rotate, pan, zoom, all set to hotkeys. So I can do this very quickly, and I don't have to think about it. It's sort of like, getting good at playing the piano. You don't have to really think about the keys that you're hitting. You just kind of know what to do after a while automatically. Okay, so I'll just get going here with the shadow, and I'll turn down the density here a little bit, and I'll just show you. See right here, see how I have to get into a tight shadow? Look at that. See, I just change the size of the brush as I go, and I can get a big wide application here, but then as I get into the area where there's a little bit of a fold over right here, change it to a small brush. Same thing here. I want to get in this little area, but I don't just want to get in here, do I? I want to also kind of go over the line a little bit, because some of this shape is going to, some of this kind of crevice here is going to bleed into the upper area. So these are the kinds of decisions that I have to make as I go. And the more you do, the easier you will have, easier time you'll have figuring out how to apply this to your own work. You just have to think about it as you go and just practice. And we get a little bit of cast shadow down there. Of course, because this is such a tight little shape here, the shadow is going to be very, very hard right here. And then we'll get that sort of ambient occlusion effect. One thing we can do if we need to is we can isolate regions. I can make a selection and just make sure that the selection is referencing the reference layer. In this case, right here, if you go to the option to, let's see if I can expand this out a little bit. Make sure that multiple referring is clicked with the check mark, and then choose right here this option. This will make sure that it is pulling the information from the reference layer. So I can make a selection, lock that in there. And then I want to get rid of this line here. So up in the toolbar, there is an option called Show Border of Selected Area. I'm just going to click that. That'll turn off the crawling ants effect. And so I can just come in here and paint, but it's gonna be locked into this region. And so this is that sort of more ambient shadow that I was talking about, where it's not really cast shadows. It's just sort of a darkening that occurs around the edge of things, okay? And that really just gets an incredible effect, I think. So there you go. That starts adding a lot of realism to it. And we'll just kind of keep going down the line like that. I'm going to isolate areas. Currently, I have this set so that when I, just to speed up a little bit my production time, I have it set to the type of selection, which will add to the selection rather than replace. And that's an option that you have up here, how to create right here. The second setting here will have every subsequent selection add to the current selection rather than replacing it. So I can very quickly select 3 areas, turn off the crawling ants, and then we can switch over to my my brush, and we just go ahead and paint the shadow into this area. Once again, raising and lowering the size of the brush as I go. There we go. Just get a little bit of an indication of the lip, you know, that kind of sticks out a little bit. This just comes from knowing my 3D shapes and just understanding where cast shadows should be, where the ambient shadow should be. Here's a little crevice. Let's fill that in. And once again, just get some of that shadow because it's very, very close to the other object here. I hope this is making sense to people. This is something that I do all day, every day. So it's I'm probably going a little bit fast, but hopefully you're getting the gist of what I'm doing here. This is something that you can apply to your own work. Once again, you'll notice that I'm going over the edge, and that's not really a problem because I don't have any shadow work done on any other object. So I can always just eliminate the shadow from there. And that allows me to just kind of be loose with my application. If I am having to be very careful, like maybe I already did a lot of shadow work in a certain area, then I'll want to make my selections, you know, and make sure that I isolate the application of shadow to the object that I'm currently on. And that way I won't accidentally, you know, ruin shadow work that I've done for another area. Okay, so something else that I'm going to do here, as I showed you before, is the highlight. Highlight's very important because in this case, because it gives you an idea of the texture of the tree. It gives it sort of a bit of a shiny look, which is kind of what I'm going for. In this project in particular, I'm trying to get kind of a toy-like effect with a lot of things. So making things look almost like they're a little bit, maybe even kind of plastic or like a shiny wood or that sort of thing, like a polished wood is an intentional effect. But this, again, this is the same process, same brush. I'm just going to go through and figure out where my highlight would be, just thinking about the position of light. And I'll go ahead and put my harder edge here to see how this is right next to a shadow. I love these kind of hard edges right here, where you can indicate that there's a sort of blend between the hard and soft edges. That's really how you create a lot of appeal. And so right then and there, you can see how I've got this indication of a reflected light here. And I'm going to do the same thing up here. I'm going to continue that, but of course I don't want it applied into this area of shadow, and I made a mistake there. So I'm just going to switch over to the transparency, wipe that out, go back to my color, or I can just isolate my selection like this, and I don't even have to worry about it. And I can just go ahead and get that little lip right there that's going to get some extra light like that. And then once again, increase the size of the brush. Look how big I just got with the brush, so I can get a big, soft application there. Okay, and then I'll kind of tighten it up and get a sharper little line in here, and that's where the light is sort of at its most powerful right there. That's kind of like where the sunlight hits it. And you know, this is an organic process. You know, you want to really think about this as you go, and this is where you really get to sort of pop out those three-dimensional shapes. We have a little rim right here. I'll bring that out because this is facing upward. There you go. And different objects, of course, have different textures. So you want to think about that. Maybe there are some areas that are a bit more, they're shinier than others. And, you know, I can indicate that maybe by increasing the density and maybe turning the brightness up a little bit on the color. So we can get a really kind of a sharper highlight here. And this is going to make this object look a little bit shinier. You know, maybe I bring a little bit of that brighter color into there as well. Okay. All right. And one other thing I feel like I should cover here is the gradient overlays. So gradient overlays are ways that you can amplify colors a little bit beyond what your base colors are without having to necessarily adjust the actual base color layer. So one way that I can do that is I'll make a new layer here, and I'm going to switch it to overlay. And overlay is like, it's a way to kind of hyper amplify your colors here. So maybe I have maybe I want to kind of amplify things a little bit toward the red orange thereabouts. So I'll choose a very, very intense orange color. And for this, I'm probably going to use the airbrush tool. Again, it depends on what you're specifically trying to do. But you watch what happens if I paint over this very quickly. You'll see how it'll really amplify the colors. That's the effect of the overlay layer. So what I want to do is in real time, I want to make a decision on where to do that. Now, one thing in a very bright light that you're going to get is when color bounces up, you're going to get some of that color is actually going to amplify because the color bounces back and forth. So as light hits this tree, the trunk here, it's going to bounce up and it's going to bring some of that color with it. So a very good place to amplify colors is on the underside of things, or where there is a sort of a tight concentration of color. And that's where you get that. It's a sort of similar to the ambient occlusion effect. In crevices like this is a great place to amplify the colors, because you're going to find that it's going to give it a really realistic effect. Now, I exaggerate this heavily in my work because I like to use really vivid colors, and of course you can do this to your heart's content. If you want to, bring out the highlight section, you can maybe switch over to a yellow, and we can just pop out that that highlight section. Maybe you want to move the area that's in shadow actually toward a green or a blue color, and so I'll actually paint over that with a greenish blue color, and once again, raise and lower the size of the brush. That's the trick. I'll switch to a softer brush for this. So you can see how you can imagine how you can do that over the entire piece, and you can really get a wonderful effect. Okay, so that's pretty much it. And when we switch back over, I'm going to turn back on my normal layers here. I'm going to try and make sure I'm selecting the right layers so you can see what the end result would be. There's my, this is another type of gradient. Same thing I just showed you, but I'm actually using the gradient tool. I'll just switch this over to a normal layer so you can see what this looks like. So here is this is how I do it, a simple gradient to bring attention to certain areas. In this case, I want Yooka and Laylee to be in highlight right here. So I bring the hottest color toward them. And I also do this on a panel by panel basis. That's just an effect that I do to try and add a little bit of oomph to the panels. You can see if I turn it on and off here, that's the effect. Here's a little highlight that I have around the book. So as you need these things, sometimes you'll think of things to add to the page that really you don't want to combine them with other layers, and that's it's important to be able to do that without messing up the work that you've already done. That's why I use so many layers. Okay, and then yeah, the rest of it really just comes down to polishing, and you can see here how I've done something like here on the flowers. Let me see if I got this on a separate layer. All right, so on what I had as the flats layer, I just eventually collapsed it all because I didn't need to make selections anymore. You can see how I've done a bit of a gradient. I've got a red color around the tips of the petals on this flower, and I've got kind of a purplish color in the center. So that just, once again, it just adds a little bit of extra oomph to it and makes it really, really beautiful. Okay, so that's about it. So what do you think, Fahim? Where are we in terms of time?
We're good. I think we're at that point where we can start asking you some questions, and I believe Michi's preparing questions, and she will get on shortly and start asking you those questions.
Okay, I'm here, and I do have questions. We have a lot of questions for you, so we'll try and get to as many as we can. Kind of going back to the first image that you were working on with the shading, we have a few questions about that. First person asks, are all of your layers vector layers?
No, I almost never use vector layers. Vector is really just something that I would do if I needed to have a resolution independent, say a logo or something like that. But no, I don't use vector layers. Everything's raster.
Okay, great. Where did you get the brush you use for shading and shadows? How did you change the brush size without clicking the program?
So I assume they're talking about the brush that I'm using here, that I use for shadows and that such. I don't know. Before this, I was telling Fahim that is inevitably a question that we're going to get. I don't know. I got this from the Clip Studio database, and I'm going to try and find out what it is. Unfortunately, I don't know what this says. Because I can't read this. So we're going to have to get that information. And so what I would do is follow up with me. I'll on my social media, I'll mention this brush, and we'll try and see if we can find out where it is. But this is just me messing around with the database and finding an available brush. And in general, it's actually very similar to the standard oil paint brush. It just has some different settings that I think are kind of ideal because of the way it blends colors together. So it does very effectively blend, which I like a lot. So you can get a really nice gradient. So we'll get that information, and you'll be able to follow up with us and find out what brush that is.
Great. Yeah, and your social media is on our website, and I believe you'll be showing it at the end too for people who want to find out where to get a hold of you.
Right.
So, okay. Next question, for your shading technique, why grayscale as opposed to darker or lighter color?
Oh, that's a great question. The reason for that is because I want to control how many effects that I have on the color. If I have a shadow that is a shadow or highlight that is taking the color from the base, it can sometimes go a little too far, and you can end up with a really gaudy effect. The nice thing about using a grayscale shadow is that it doesn't manipulate or change the color in any way, and that allows me to modify the color without being too confused about what layer is actually affecting the color. So like, well, I'll give you a simple example of that. If I were to switch over to here, and let's just pull up this shadow, I'm going to lock transparency in the shadow, and I'm going to change it to a color. So let's just say that I go with that mid-range, and let's say it's blue, and whoops, not the right layer. And let's lock this layer, fill. So what I just did is Option Delete. That is a fill. You can also go up to Edit Fill, like that. You can see what happened there is it's actually changing the shadow to a blue color. And of course you could do this with any particular color you wanted, but because of the amplification that this does to the colors already on there, I end up losing control. So I get very confused very easily. I'm an artist, so I need to make sure that I keep things as organized and clean as possible. Okay?
Okay, great. Next question, any tips on choosing which colors to use, especially when you do a very colorful piece?
Choosing which colors, well, it's this is one of the kind of the sneaky secrets about color theory. I've never been a big advocate of color theory, traditionally speaking, because I think a lot of what people actually need when they're worrying about color theory is actually value. Okay, and the reason that color, basically, you can use any colors you want in any combination. And still have a very readable piece as long as the values work. So a simple way to demonstrate that is I'm just going to flatten this image here, and I'm going to bring up Command U. That will bring up my hue saturation settings, and I'm going to drag the saturation slider all the way down. Okay, so what you want to make sure that you can do with any given piece is that you want to make sure that things are clear and readable, right? When they switch to black and white, this is how you know that your values are good, or that you want to make sure that areas of contrast are well allocated. So regardless of what colors I use, it's still going to be readable. So even if you get very, very vivid colors, it's still going to work as long as your values work. So what I would say is when it comes to colors, go to your heart's content with the colors. I like to use crazy rainbow gradients all over the place. I mean, a good example would be this piece right here, for example, or actually here, if you look at this piece from Dreamside, so I'm using very, very intense kind of Lisa Frank colors. But it works, I think, because it's still very readable because the values are there. You can see that what's going on outside the window is a very light value compared to what's in the room. And so this all still, you can still read what's going on, even though I have these like crazy gradients all over the place. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, this is a long one. Let's see. I noticed you using gray for your shadows on the multiply layer while shading your character. Do you typically use tones of gray for shadows, or do you use colors? I think you kind of answered that already, but
yeah, that's what I always use gray, and there's almost never a case where I use color. But what I do sometimes is I'll use different levels of gray. So you can see, if I need to get a lighter shadow, then I'll just use, since it's a multiply layer, it's always going to darken. So I'll just use a different degree of gray tone.
okay, let's see. It says, would you recommend to optimize the process of coloring multiple panels of a comic so that it can be a little faster while still remaining quality?
Yes,
Any thoughts on that?
if you have any ways of figuring that out, please let me know, because I've been trying to figure out how to speed things up. The problem is there's always a balance between the organic nature of what you're trying to do with the hand-drawn organic quality, and also the production speed that you're trying to achieve. Obviously, the more procedural you can make elements, the faster the process will go. Yooka uses an extremely organic process, and there are certain things that I can kind of do procedurally. A good example is just making sure I use the same exact process of doing flats, doing shadows, doing bounce light, and kind of going through the stages that way. One thing I might do, for example, if I'm doing color fills, maybe I'll do all the characters that are in a spread at once. So I have that green color for Yooka, right? I'll apply that to all the Yookas, and that way I can go through kind of quickly. And that's pretty much as close as I get to procedural. There's really, in order to get that organic quality, I'm treating it like a traditional painting, and so it's a trade-off. It takes a long time, and it's very time consuming, but the end result, I think, is worth it.
Okay, great. Thank you. A lot of people are asking where they can find more on you and your processes. So we'll discuss that at the end of the webinar. We'll tell you where you can go to see more on David. So we'll address those at the end. Let's see, this is a long one. Let's see if we can answer their question. When the drawing/illustration is all done and we're merging all the layers together, do we have to change the reference layer back to just a raster layer before we do the full merging of layers? Are there any types of layers we need to readjust before our final merging is done?
Well, it depends on what you mean by final merging. I assume when you say final merging, you're saying to prepare the image for print or something to that effect. And of course, what I would say in that case is you want to make sure that you preserve all of your layers always. You always want to have your backup file that you can go to. And when it comes to exporting the file, that you can use for print, that's a very simple process. You just basically go up to File and Export, and you can export in any one of these, and then formats, and then you can choose your resolution and that sort of thing. I think one thing was wrong about that question in terms of misunderstanding reference and raster. Those two are not mutually exclusive. Reference layer is when you make something a reference layer. You can make any layer a reference layer. It doesn't matter if it's a raster or vector. Raster is sort of the organic pixelated option over raster, which is a different type of mathematically determined line that is resolution independent. And so with raster graphics, what you need to make sure is the resolution that you're going to be printing, and just work within that. And try not to go overboard. People tend to worry about resolution a little bit more than they have to, but you never really have to flatten or convert away from raster graphics. Once I set up a layer, I leave it alone, and then I do merge where possible, but it's mostly for the sake of organization. Clip Studio, one thing that Clip Studio does better than any software any art software I've ever used, and it pretty much beats them by a mile, is its ability to handle a massive amount of layers and in very, very high resolution files. So the only downside to that, of course, is that you can end up with very disorganized files. So what I would do is just, you give yourself a lot of freedom, and you can end up causing yourself problems. So try to stay organized with your layers, and you'll never really have to merge them together.
Okay, great. We have a question. Where do you find the option to clear the crawling ants?
Oh, that's in the toolbar up at the top, or what is it called, Michi? We have the bar up here. The bar at the top of the screen. Yes, there is this little feature up here, the show border of selected area, and I don't really want to cover it just because there are a few steps involved, but you can get a little. Basically, if I make a selection, right, you get this launcher right here that has often used features. You can adjust the settings for that by clicking the rightmost option within the selection launcher, which again, you only get once you've made a selection, and then you can choose to add whatever features you want to it. So it can go way outside this. For example, maybe I want to clear an area, so I can make my selection. Here's the clear, so that will clear the detail that's on that particular layer. Clip Studio also lets you select multiple layers at once, and you can do everything. You can apply that clear, for example, to every single layer at the same time. This is extremely useful. This is another fantastic feature with Clip Studio. Same thing goes with scaling. You can scale the material within multiple layers at the same time, which, as far as I know, you cannot do in other programs. At least not Photoshop. I don't think you can. I think you have to do that layer by layer, or put them in a folder. I don't really know. Anyway, not to get off the beaten path, but here I think that's what the question involved.
Okay. Someone would like to know if you use the speech bubble tool in Clip Studio Paint, or do you create them manually?
I create them manually just because in this particular project I have organic bubbles that are kind of, they're drawn just like every other element. And there are some great tools. You can sort of use some elements of the speech bubbles, and just to be honest, I haven't really used it much, but this is what my text section looks like here. So I actually have, I'll just go through this. I've got the line itself, which I do just like every other element. I have the text, which I retain this, the ability to edit, because since I work independently with these books, I do edit as I go, and sometimes I'll change text even later on within a production. I have a fill here, and I also have sort of a shadow that goes underneath the bubbles, and that helps it blend with the comic page, because one of the things that I find that is often a weird thing about comics is when word bubbles do not match aesthetically with the art behind it. So I like to make sure that the bubbles look like they belong as part of the art as well. So yeah, I do hand draw them.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple questions regarding your backgrounds. I know that's probably not a short answer, but if you could maybe just touch on it. So any tips on drawing backgrounds? How do you decide, excuse me, what to draw, and how do you fill in the background?
Yeah, that is a complicated question, just because there's so many possible answers to that. What I would say in general is everything is determined by the story needs. So if you take it in steps, and you remember to prioritize and balance things well. So as you're writing your story, think about what the stories that you're trying to tell, and don't even worry about the art at that point. And of course, this is assuming that you are writing the story and you're not exclusively the artist on one. But if you are creating your own story, just write what works. Write what works for the story, and that's a totally different thing in terms of writing. But you do need to think about the storytelling within the visuals. So a good example is with this page, I have to know. Just as importantly, what I'm trying to convey within this image, I have to know what I'm trying to convey in the adjacent images. So what happened before this, what is happening after this. And this is a moment in the book where the characters have, they've basically jumped through this book, and that's like a portal into a fantasy world. And so they came into this world facing the wrong direction in the previous page, and there's basically a sort of a void in the other direction, and it's just a little point of humor where the characters comment on how boring the world looks, and so they turn around, and the last panel on the previous page has the character reacting to the excitement of this new world. So I knew that when the reader turns the page, I wanted there to be an impactful moment when there's a piece that would really kind of wow the reader and make them get excited about this new world. And so that was the goal for this page, and one of the reasons I'm showing this particular one off. So it really just depends on the story needs and what it is that you have to convey. So I know that's only scratching the surface of that question, because the question really is almost like, how do you make a good comic? So it's definitely a very open question that you kind of just have to practice over time.
Okay, great, thanks. I had a feeling that was a difficult one to answer, but let's see. Not sure if this is the right place. You mentioned using the eraser tool. Was it painting with transparency? Does that work with any value or color?
Painting with transparency. Now, you're asking, I assume the person is asking that if you move to transparency sorry?
Well, I think you showed when you were drawing Yooka-Laylee that you were using transparency instead of the eraser tool. I think that's what you said.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I guess they're useful. Well, okay. I think I know what they're asking is essentially when you're painting with the transparency. The reason that I like that is if I switch over to the eraser right now, for example, I have different settings for the eraser tool than my brush, right? So this is one of the common pitfalls of digital art is that that I see is when you use too many different tools, you can end up with kind of a weird hodgepodge of different kind of stylistic approaches to elements within the page, and you kind of lose that that harmony. So the reason that I like to use transparency is that I'm actually using the same exact settings as the brush. I'm just painting with transparency. So like, let's say I had to pick out an area here where there was a bit more shadow. Maybe these leaves were in the sunlight as well. You know, I can just paint out that shadow in the same way, and it'll stylistically match. Now, if you want to have different degrees of application, again, you just adjust the settings, like how vividly is it affecting the shadow. It's all going to be based in this case on pressure sensitivity and the brush density, and that's pretty much how I am affecting that. So there you go.
Okay, great. So we are at 1 hour, but we do have a few more questions. So if it's okay with you guys, we'll keep going for a couple more minutes.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. With bounced light layers, how do you choose which color to use for the reflected light?
Well, that's really a choice that you have to make creatively. But if you want to go the realism route, like here on the underside of the flower, you can see I've got a little bit of kind of a yellowish greenish color. That's because it's reflecting the grass. So because it's pulling the color of adjacent areas when I do bounce light. You know, it's not used everywhere. Like right here on the underside, I've got a little bit here, and that's just pulling the exact same color up. You have to be very careful doing this though, because you don't want to destroy your values. You know, if something's in the a shadow area, then it should be value-wise, it should be darker. But with the bounce light, you can bring it up so high that you can kill your values. But you know, that's part of creating a sort of global illumination. So just bear in mind the adjacent colors, and that's generally what happens when colors bounce.
Okay, we've had a few people ask this. So where did you go to school, or did you go to school?
Well, I did go to school. I did go to an art school. However, I went to an art school focused on computer animation, which is actually no longer around, unfortunately. And so, but you know, in terms of my education, it was focused purely on computer animation, and I did not really get that much of illustration and tutorials and classes. And the reason that I bring that up is because most of what I've learned in terms of drawing is stuff that I've learned by actually just doing work, which is the best way to learn. And this is something that I often say to people that I remember moving out to California when I started my job at Insomniac, and I would often talk to people who were in their 50s or 60s who would talk about how they need to learn how to do various production techniques, and these would be people who are Disney animators and people who are at the top of we'll say the top of the industry, and yet they still feel like they're not ready to go and do that project that they want to do. And that always drove me nuts, because I figured the best way to learn how to do something is to apply it to an actual project. That's what I did with Dreamside. So I thought, I don't really know how to make comics, I don't know how to make graphic novels. So I'll just get started with a project, because then I'll have the motivation to get through what I have to learn, and I'll know exactly what it is that I have to learn. That way I'm not learning forever, because artists notoriously want to learn forever. I mean, it's a common phrase that we say, where we're always learning, and then you can be 80 years old and be worried about dying before you do your you've learned your whole life, great, but why not apply it to something right away, and then you can learn as you go. So that's something I would strongly advise you to do, is just get started with a project, and you will learn about the techniques that you need. And you don't really need to go to an art school to do that. You just have to do it. It's a practice-based thing.
Okay. Can you give an estimate of how long it takes you to finish one of your pages?
That's a very hard thing to describe, because it's a very subjective process, and pages do change. I've had, what I can do is give you a range. I've had pages that take a half a day. I've had pages that take 7 days. So it really depends on what's involved with the page. This page in particular is one that actually took me quite a long time to produce. And part of that was because I was going through and modifying the style of it. And this also was a defining page of the of this region, which I was kind of reworking all the way up to finishing the page. So there were a lot of edits along the way. And that's another reason it's difficult to describe that, is that oftentimes I'll go back to pages that are already finished and I will edit them because maybe I've stylistically altered the aesthetics of that region. Just changes have to be made. So I really can't give a good answer to that. I'm sorry.
Problem. We're getting to the end here. We have a few questions that are just too long to try and answer. Let me see if I can find one more. What was your starting point or inspiration for your books?
Well, that depends on the project. Dreamside,
Yeah.
Dreamside was one, actually, if you can believe it. I wrote this story a long time ago. When I was in college, I actually used to volunteer at a children's hospital. And at the children's hospital, I was in the child life department. It was something I could do while I was in college and I was learning to draw. And I thought that would be kind of a fun thing, is to go and draw with kids that were in the hospital. And while in there, I noticed that there were some kids that were in there for a long period of time. I was there for, I think, about a 6-month period. And I do remember one girl in particular who was there every week. And so I don't know if she basically just lived in the hospital or not, but that was an inspiring concept to me. And I wondered what it would be like to kind of live in the hospital and want to escape, because it really is kind of I don't want to call it an oppressive space, but it is definitely a sort of a life-altering experience to be in the hospital, even just for a few days. So to kind of be there long-term, I thought that's a very potent concept for a story, where I can sort of blend together some of my favorite concepts, like the never-ending story, and there's a little Peter Pan in there, but kind of mix it in with a medical theme. So that was a big thing that I wanted to do. When I got out of college, this is way back in 2003, I actually wrote the original draft of the story, and then it just took me a very long time to figure out that I wanted to turn it into a book, and so I just did, and that's how Dreamside got started. When it came to Yooka-Laylee, this is the start of a series of books that I'm calling the Game Legends series. And what it is I come from games. I love games, and there's so many great games made today. Amazing characters, amazing worlds, and I worked in storytelling at Insomniac. Part of my job, the major portion of my job, was in storytelling elements within the game, whether they be cinematics, cinematic sequences that you'd see as movies, or that they were interactive segments. But I was always focused on characters and storytelling, and so I got to work with all these great interactive elements. But I thought, one thing that's kind of neat is one thing I always loved as a kid is when I would see a comic made of a game that I really enjoyed, and I thought there's a lot of opportunity, because within a game you don't really have the same kind of storytelling methodology as you do within a book, and so they kind of work in harmony together. And so this is an opportunity for me to expand on concepts within games and turn them into graphic novels that I think will sit right up against the games on which they're based, and that's really the inspiration for it. Yooka-Laylee in particular is a game. Well, first of all, I love the game, and I really love the team. This is a team that created a lot of games I loved as a kid, and so it was a pleasure and an honor to work with this property. And so I've just done everything I can to try and bring out what I loved about the game, and I thought this is just a great opportunity. And of course, now I am talking to more studios about adapting more games, and Yooka-Laylee is the first project in that lineup.
Right, okay. And the last question we have for you is regarding your Kickstarter campaign that you did for this Yooka-Laylee book. It was very successful. So any tips on artists out there that may want to do a Kickstarter campaign on their own, and how you were able to have such success with it? That would be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's kind of a multifaceted question. There are a few things. What I would say is kind of the general response to that is consider what your main goals are. And that's an answer that I give to just about everything, is just understand your goals and focus on what's important to you and what's not important to you. There really is, there's never really, I find, a perfect solution for anything. The reason Yooka-Laylee as a Kickstarter would not have happened if it wasn't for some negative experiences that I had trying to get Dreamside out there. So I did have this original project called Dreamside, which if anyone has tried to make their original concept and put it out there, you'll find it's very, very difficult to get people to look at it, just even to see it or react to it. And I would say for maybe the first couple of years that I had presented anything from Dreamside, it took so much work just to get a few views on anything that I created. And so I was able to interest a few publishers, but what I heard from them in general was that I would probably only sell about 500 books or so in the first year, which if you know about how little you can actually make through book sales, it's really not a living by any stretch of the imagination. And that is kind of a big deal when you're spending your full time doing this. Now, of course, you can do this as a supplementary job, but that's very, very, it's hard to get the kind of caliber of quality that I think a lot of artists are going for if they're trying to work on their nights and weekends. So it's a balancing act. So, I thought if I were to go through and do a Kickstarter for Dreamside, it might not be very successful. And, maybe it could have been, but I really don't think it would have been especially successful. And so I thought, okay, I need to think about ways that I can develop a bigger following. And I thought maybe instead of trying to bring followers to me, I would go to places where there are already followers, where there is already a fan base. And something like Yooka-Laylee, I thought, well, Yooka-Laylee already has a bunch of people who like it, and maybe if there was a book that was based on Yooka-Laylee, that might interest them. And I thought, well, can I make a book based on Yooka-Laylee and make it good? And I thought, well, yeah, I can, because whether it's characters that I invented or characters that I love from games I enjoy, I can make a good story out of that. And there's no reason I can't make a good book out of Yooka-Laylee. And so if there was a way to make that happen, I thought, why not? Reached out to the studio, and it took a little bit of work to convince them to go for it. This is my first actual published book, so it takes a little bit of we'll say finessing and trying to negotiate and all of that. So that took some work. So be prepared for that, and a fair amount of money spent on legal expenses and setting up a contract and that sort of thing. But once that was all set up, they kind of it was a serendipitous situation, because they're a great company to work with, and they were very trusting in me, and they kind of let me go. And so what I ultimately realized was the important thing to me is being able to have a sense of control over my own art, being able to do something that I believe in, and have the freedom and creativity to make a good story. I don't necessarily care if I have to invent the characters in the world. Okay, so I had a thing that was important to me and a thing that wasn't important to me. I said, all right, let's cut out the original thing, and I'll work on something that comes from somebody else, and I'll put all my effort into that. Spend about, in total, I think it's gonna be 2.5 years developing a book. The other thing about the Kickstarter that I would strongly advise, Kickstarter has kind of a major perception issue. No, reputation issue, because oftentimes what people do is they do Kickstarters for good reason at the beginning of developments. But the problem with that is that things can sometimes take a lot longer than expected. And I don't know too many Kickstarters that did ship even remotely close to being on time. So what I thought is, I'll take on the risk and develop the majority of the book. And then when it's, at least, I'd say no more than 6 months away from fulfillment, then I'll do the Kickstarter. That way I have a lot of good stuff to show. People can see it. There's a sense of completion to it, and they feel confident in its quality and the fact that I'm going to finish this project. So I think that makes a big difference. And that combined with the fact that it was a known property, I think helped that Kickstarter. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, great. So that's it. Fahim, do you want to take the reins and wrap up?
Absolutely. Let's do that. I'm going to share my screen now. All right, perfect. David, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I hope everyone gets a chance to check out David's website. It's available on the screen that you're looking at right now, dreamprismpress.com/store. Check out his Yooka-Laylee book. If you're interested in pre-ordering and purchasing it, that's a great place to do it.
Yeah, Fahim, if you don't mind me just jumping in on that, just so people know that the address on the screen, dreamprismpress.com/books is that does go to my website, but if you go to dreamprismpress.com/store, it is going to take you to the backer kit store for the book, which is in a pre-order state right now. I am collecting pre-orders probably until the end of June, and that will get people in on this first printing, which is a collector's edition hardcover. So until the end of June, that will be available, and then I'm going to close orders on that.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that information. As well, we do recommend that you follow David on all of his social media handles. That way you get a chance to interact with him, find the latest info regarding Yooka-Laylee, and as well, if we have any unanswered questions, I believe David will answer some of those on his social media platforms. And so hopefully that'll be a great way to engage and interact with them.
Mm-hmm. And one last note I want to make: if you do go to dreamprismpress.com and you want to be first notified about any upcoming details of future projects, I do let people know in my mailing list first. So go ahead and hit that, add your email to the little subscribe box on the homepage, and you'll be part of the cool list of people who get great details of upcoming Dream Prism projects.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. Once again, thank you so much for your time, David, for going through your beloved project. We look forward to it and seeing it in its finality as well. For all of you who have taken the time to join us today, thank you so much. Thank you to Michi. For more information on Clip Studio Paint, please go to clipstudio.net/en, as well as at graphicsly.com. And with that, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Take care.